Before we dive into the topic, though, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. Let me just see if I can actually switch my slides. There you go. My name's Victoria. It's spelled weird because I'm from Poland originally, so I moved to the UK 8 years ago. And my journey to work in AI and in ethics of AI specifically started with me doing a philosophy degree as my undergraduate degree. And back then, I really enjoyed kind of all matters ethics, but didn't really kind of see a pathway to make that into a job. But after my second year of university, I worked on a research project about how we can improve chatbots by using some of the notions from philosophy of language. And it was really cool from philosophy side, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about computer science to actually be able to verify what I was saying. And so because of that, I pursued a master's in computer science with speech and language processing. That's way before ChatGPT was cool. So it was back in 2019. And it was really enjoyable to kind of dive deeper into tech, and that led me to join the tech sector in a number of roles. I wasn't that good at writing code, but I found a place for myself in project management, delivery management, and product management roles, kind of across a number of fields, mostly related to cloud. But there was always something missing for me, and so because of that, I started looking further. I think during the pandemic, a lot of people had a bit of a deeper think about what they're doing with their lives. And for me, that led to joining the UK government to work as a policy advisor at Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And that's where I really started working on ethics properly and engaging with the topic. And it was really interesting. Back then, the UK was hosting the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Prize Challenge with the US government. So I got to kind of explore a lot of that side of technology, but also the initial foundations for the UK's AI white paper about how we can approach regulating AI started to form. But nonetheless, I left civil service to kind of work more closely with clients day to day. And so I've been at Sopra Steria since August 2022. And since I got to do some amazing stuff that I can tell you about a bit more during the presentation as well. But today the topic is not me, but AI and the ethics of AI specifically. So what I want to talk you through is a bit of a story, and I want us to kind of think to the future, to 2025, not 2025, 2050 even, and what could happen. And we'll consider two alternative scenarios of what that future could look like and how ethics has a role to play in one of them. So meet Tina. Tina lives in 2050, and she enjoys quite a lot of amenities and developments of the new tech powered by AI and other technologies as well. And so Tina and her friends all have automated and fully autonomous vehicles, so she can jump into her car and just tell it where to go, and it does all the driving for her. Whenever Tina's ill, she can just call up the doctor's office, but doesn't have to interact with anyone. She can just log in with her secure login that's based on her voice and list some symptoms, and it all figures it out for herself so that she gets personalized medicine and gets diagnosed incredibly quickly without needing to leave her home. At her home, Tina enjoys a lot of amenities. So all of her devices are connected to her smartphone. She's able to put the heating on before she gets back home so that it's all nice and warm and ready for her. All of her appliances in the kitchen are synced to her daily schedule, so the coffee makes itself, as it were. And she gets personalized recommendations from her wardrobe about what to wear based on the weather outside and what meetings are in her calendar. But Tina enjoys quite an expensive lifestyle, so recently she's been looking to apply for loans, but all she needs to do is provide the banks with her social media profile, and they figure out what her maximal credit limit is and base the recommendations of the right products on the basis of her previous spending. She's also looking for a new job, and she's been looking to apply to quite a few companies, but because she's in 2050, again, she doesn't have to do anything apart from giving the organization she wants to apply to a login or yeah, an identifier that links all of her social media accounts and a small video that she recorded of herself. And so she doesn't need to do anything. The process happens kind of in the background. All she needs to do is basically say, I want a job, and they figure out everything else. And then finally, Tina really enjoys her friend that is not a person. It's a chatbot. And so she talks to her friend regularly, now with very reliable text-to-speech processing. So she comes back home and complains about her day or shares all the joys and dreams with that chatbot. And obviously that's a somewhat appealing version of the future that we can think about. There is a lot of positives and a lot of advancements. And actually, when you think to some of the things I mentioned in terms of examples, these things are already happening. We've got somewhat autonomous vehicles, or at least some of that functionality already emerging. We know there is big drive for medicine to be more personalized and for a lot of the call centers to be kind of more automated by the use of AI. We've got smart homes and we've got a lot of devices that we can connect to our phones. I can start my car 10 minutes before I leave the house because it's really cold actually. I'm based in Scotland. We've had a lot of snowfall, so I can get the car running so that it's warm and nice and ready for me to go when I'm ready. With the banks, we've got a lot of data sharing that happens already and a lot of analysis on what our spending patterns are and a lot of recommendations that can help us make better decisions. And likewise, a lot of organizations are already using CV sifting that is powered by AI, but also automated platforms to analyze the videos of the candidates. And finally, a lot of us have heard what's been happening in the ChatGPT debate and the conversations about whether it's sentient, and a lot of people falling for feeling that it can be our friend. So we're seeing that we're somewhat on a trajectory to reach that future, or a very similar version thereof, where in all these areas we'll see developments such that we'll have that automation, AI being everywhere, and we will get to experience quite a lot of that. But what I want you to think about now is an alternative 2050, because while we set this one out as something that we probably will get to, there's probably a bit of a shadow that we can show is already starting to form on our journey to that future. So yes, Tina might have an autonomous vehicle, but one day she's driving and something unexpected happens. Someone wearing a completely different costume that the training data wasn't trained on jumps out onto the road, and the car doesn't know what to do. It assumes, or it doesn't classify it as a person and just keeps on going. And as a result, Tina is in a car that might hurt someone quite a lot because she runs over a person. We said, she calls up and gets her diagnosis very quickly without ever speaking to a person. But actually, Tina's a woman, and we know that there's a lot of problems when it comes to the data bias in medicine and in other areas, meaning that the data about women is less frequent, and it also means that the diagnosis might be less accurate. So let's assume that Tina speaks with a very heavy accent, and the solution that's being deployed doesn't recognize that accent very well. So some of the things that she says get almost lost in translation, if you like. So yes, she might call up, and yes, she might get a quick diagnosis, but that is not a guarantee that that diagnosis is right. And without a person being there to validate it, she can find herself in quite a lot of trouble. We talked about the smart home and the opportunities that connecting devices could bring, but what Tina didn't realize is that she didn't set privacy settings properly. And actually, from the patterns of her usage of her fridge and her smart cooker and everything else, a potential stalker or abuser can infer when she's at home and wait for her, or even more so, hack into the system when she's got cameras inside, and yeah, observe her without her knowledge. And again, this is something that's already happened quite a number of times that we've heard about. Talked about Tina applying for loans and doing so in an automated manner, but actually there has been quite a lot of issues with the automated decision making in the banking system as well, where there have been instances of bias depending on the gender that you are, or other factors that you might not be able to you might not have an impact on at all, but you're being deemed higher risk and therefore declined some of the services that you could be available to you. We talked about Tina applying for jobs and having to do very little to do that. And while for a lot of us that would be the dream, because a lot of recruitment processes take quite a long time, let's think about the AI underneath that, and let's assume that Tina has something on her CV that the system just doesn't seem to like, but she doesn't know that the system is working in the background. And what's more, let's assume that a lot of the companies that she's applying for are using the same provider to get that AI system. And so if she messes up and the system, if you like, discriminates against her, then she's suddenly finding that she cannot find a job because all of the organizations she's applying to are using the same set of models to determine if someone progresses to the next stage. And so she's left without a job. And finally, we talked about Tina finding a confidant in her chatbot, but as she talks and talks to it, it suddenly starts to be very negative to her and say very nasty things, and in the end leads her to be in quite a difficult mental state. But she's entrusted a lot of her feelings and attachment to that, thinking that it is an actual person that has conscience and that will be able to be her friend. So that's the alternative 2050. And actually, when I think where we are in terms of the trajectory of our development, I think this is the 2050 that is more likely to happen. Obviously, some of these things are quite exaggerated, and we didn't dive into the technical detail of what that could look like exactly and what the failures are. But this 2050 is something that I'm really worried about. I'm not worried about AI taking over the world or wiping out human race, but rather these examples of issues that we encounter in modern AI systems and the current pressures to kind of put products out in the market without appropriate checks. So some of the things that have failed are, like I mentioned, that lack of representative data that is still a problem we're grappling with. It's way and more and more acknowledged that we are struggling with it, but it doesn't mean that it's been solved. So, the lack of diversity in the data, but also in the development teams who would query what kind of data sources we're using or whether they're representative enough of the population, means that we're not progressing and addressing this issue as quickly as we should be. And secondly, the failure to generalize, and that is a that is an issue that AI systems face at the moment, and that's particularly prominent when it comes to the conversation of autonomous vehicles. So, if you transpose that to a child, you show a child color blue and you show a child an apple. If a child saw a blue apple, it would be able to tell you it's a blue apple without having seen one before. But AI systems are not particularly good at that. And we've seen a number of issues with AI, particularly around autonomous vehicles, that fails. I think the one I read about lately was about Tesla recognizing the moon as yellow light and therefore slowing the driver down because it encountered something that wasn't shown to it before. So they failed to generalize on some of the concepts that they've seen, but they also failed to act in circumstances not encountered so far. And again, that might be really, really dangerous, particularly in the context of road traffic. But we can also think about, diseases and unusual makeup of humans that can be found on different scans. When we don't have appropriate governance and guardrails, we might trust the system because it will come up with something. It's just whether that something actually represents what should happen. And a lot of the problems that Tina has encountered in her alternative for 2050 stem from the fact that there was no human in the loop. When we talked about the doctor, there was no person to actually review and intervene. And similarly with the AI hiring process, if there isn't a person to monitor what the AI system is doing and to make sure that it's doing what it should be doing, then we are really risking quite a lot of harm happening before we find out that something's wrong. And in the case of the hiring, Tina wasn't aware that AI system was in operation. And likewise, with the chatbot, I think when ChatGPT first boomed, a lot of people didn't understand that it could provide inadequate or false information. So that lack of transparency about what the system is doing and what it could fail on, and what data it was trained on, is very, very crucial when it comes to kind of raising the risk, and also enabling us as individuals to understand that AI is there, and potentially, seek recourse or redress when things happen that shouldn't have. Then we had the issue of bias, and that very much relates to the lack of representative data and the way systems are being built. So if we're not building with all users or potential users in mind, then we'll absolutely have to address the issue of bias further down the line, but why not address it straight off? And limited agency, which is related to that lack of transparency. If you don't know that you're being subject to AI decision making, how are you supposed to kind of act in that scenario? How are you supposed to make decisions autonomously if there is AI in the background deciding things for you? And then we've got an issue of the lack of accessibility of the solution. And we've seen that with the example of the car. We've seen that in smart homes and other kind of detectors that, again, are not trained on data that is representative of the population. So quite famously, a few years back, Jo Bolamwini, when she was doing her research, she did find that a lot of facial recognition software did not work on her until she put on a white mask because it just wasn't trained on sufficient amount of Black female data. So we've got a problem with that. And again, that goes back to the data and to asking the right questions at the right time to make sure that the data is indeed representative and that we're building systems with everyone in mind. And then finally, quite a common issue that is emerging. Well, it has been a problem for quite a while, but I think quite more prominent at the moment with ChatGPT being so human-like and that generative AI being able to maintain the conversation in such a human-like way. We are seeing that conviction that computer knows better. And I think for a lot of people, it still seems that, you give some data to computer, it will churn it out. It will not be as biased, and that computers are so clever. And because of that, they're probably right when we're wrong. But actually, we are building these systems. So yes, they might be emphasizing some of the things, they might be getting to the results quicker than we would be. But essentially, they don't know better. We need to make sure that we can trust them to know before we make any decisions on the basis of what they have suggested. And so that got a bit gloomy, sorry about that. But so these are some of the failures that we encounter, and that's the alternative 2050 that we might be heading towards if we don't address these issues now. And how do we do that? We do that through embedding digital ethics. And I mentioned AI ethics at the start. AI ethics is a subset of digital ethics. So when we talk about digital ethics, we talk about a systematic way of defining principles of right and wrong and identifying and mitigating risks with regards to the impacts of any technology and its and data use on humans, society, and the environment. So, a lot of people, when they hear ethics, they think that, I will come in and say, oh, this is right, this is wrong, you're a good person, you're an evil person. Actually, what we're doing is a bit different. So within ethics, we're trying to ask what are the what are the things that matter to us, and how do we make sure that they're present in the systems? And when we need to make trade-offs, because between some of these things, for example, maintaining privacy of the data versus being transparent about how some systems work, there might be a point at which we need to sacrifice one or the other because we're not able to be transparent without revealing too much about the data. For example, digital ethics provides that framework that allows you to kind of spell out the trade-off that you're making and make that decision in a systematic manner, so that it isn't down to an individual to make that decision, but rather there is a process in place that we can rely on and things that we can measure against, so that we're making these decisions and documenting them, and we're able to put reasoning behind them. And so within digital ethics at Sopra Steria, we'll look at 6 principles that you've got on the right-hand side, and you recognize that they will relate to some of the pitfalls that we've seen in the scenario that I presented. So what we use these principles for, they're foundation for the framework that then we use to support the building of the solutions. And so we call that building an ethics by design. And on the screen, you've got 2 images of ethics by design by a couple of prompts that I put into generative AI. Not really sure what they are, but they're fun to look at. But when we talk about ethics by design, kind of mean 2, I guess, streams of work that you can think about. First is through governance. So starting from an idea for a solution, a system, a product, we need to make sure that we're asking the questions against those 6 principles to understand what the potential impacts of building of the product could be, and then throughout the life cycle of building it, that we're querying and making sure that we're addressing the issues as they emerge. So issues related to bias, a strategy to be transparent about the solution in a meaningful way, making sure that it is accessible to everyone, that it doesn't harm the planet. And so that governance allows us to ask the right questions and introduce the right processes to make sure that these risks are identified and addressed at the right time. And then the second part is around the wider transformation. So a lot of what I do isn't actually setting up the governance processes, but rather looking at what makes that governance work or not work. And we see it quite a lot, in the field of cybersecurity and elsewhere, that, there are processes and we're being told, for example, don't click on emails that look like phishing emails, don't click on that link, or change your password, don't share your passwords. And yes, the process is there because you're being told, there's training, but actually how many organizations still fall because of someone clicking on that phishing email? So in digital ethics, we look deeper and try to understand, well, what are the foundations to make that process work? And a lot of it is about the right culture in the organization. So imprinting on the employees the importance of addressing these issues and on making sure that they are considering them as they're building the systems, and incentivizing the right behaviors. And one of my favorite examples is from when I worked with a bank last year, and we found that there was a lot of drive to have good data quality, but how that was measured was that dataset owners would be put on their dashboard, and if there weren't issues with their data reported, they'd get a green status, but if there were some issues, they would go amber or red. And then, whether they had green or amber or red was then fed into their managers. And so no one wanted to report any issues, because if they didn't, their status would be green and they would look good to their managers. But what that actually meant was that the issues with the data were not being addressed, were not being recognized and addressed as they should have been, because obviously you want to do well at your job and you don't want to look bad in front of your manager. So why would you? Why would you report it if you would get penalized with that amber or red status? So we look a lot at how we can make sure that we're incentivizing the right behaviors. How can we train people to help them understand some of the ethics issues that they might come up against? But also, governance is just that skeleton in the process. We need to make sure that the data underneath it works, that everyone who works in that space has access to the right tools, and that they have that message coming from the top about the importance of these issues. So, day to day, what I do is kind of combining the two. So depending on where we are with an organization, it can be looking at some of the specific parts of it. So looking at its culture, or looking at the wider policy that it's got, or digging deeper into the processes regarding the building of models, also processes surrounding data, or procuring technology, which again is quite an unaddressed issue quite a lot of the time. You might have great process internally, but if you're using technology that you haven't actually verified against, then you're opening yourself up to similar ethics issues. And the good news is that, within the field of ethics, I think the importance of addressing it has really risen to the top, with particularly generative AI coming to the forefront for a lot of people. So we are seeing a lot more interest in this area, and a lot more organizations are looking to make sure that as they implement AI, they are addressing these issues before they emerge. And there's a lot of regulatory activity as well. So we will see that organizations hopefully soon will have to comply with a number of obligations as well that will help them, that will help us as a society make sure that the systems that are being developed have been developed with appropriate assurance in mind. So that's the day-to-day. And so some of the key takeaways I want you to go away with is that, yes, AI promises a lot of incredible opportunities, like we saw in that 2050 example, but they're not evenly distributed. And some of us stand to benefit more than others. But what we really need to do is make sure that everyone can benefit and that no one's harmed along the way. And the means to do that is making sure that ethics is embedded from the start through appropriate governance, but also the wider organizational makeup. That means that the risk of harm is reduced. And the principles that I showed you, a lot of organizations will have them, but the question that is very important and very difficult is, how do you go from the principles to the actual implementation? How do you change the way you build things with these principles in mind? And this is where AI ethics comes in, and this is what I do in my job. So it was really nice to tell you all about that, and I'm happy to open up for questions if there are any.